Hand shoved into his back, cuffs slicing into his wrists, Elijah stumbled into the courtroom, not as a lawyer, not as a witness, but as a suspect. The charge? Impersonating an attorney. The real crime? Being a young black man daring to defend himself too well. His real law degree, his real bar license, none of it mattered. In their eyes, he wasn't supposed to be there. But they made one fatal mistake. They pushed the wrong man too far. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse swung open with a groan, swallowing Elijah Cross into its cavernous halls. He adjusted his tie, crisp, dark blue, and smoothed the lapel of his tailored suit. Everything about him spoke of preparation, clean lines, calm steps, sharp eyes. Elijah wasn't a stranger here. As a newly minted attorney, just 6 months sworn into the Georgia bar, he had fought for every inch of ground beneath his polished shoes. Today wasn't a hearing for one of his clients. Today, he was standing up for himself. He made his way to courtroom 2C, where a civil dispute hearing was about to start, a case involving a predatory landlord who had evicted dozens of black tenants without cause. Elijah had volunteered to represent one of the tenants pro bono, a woman named Miss Patrice Wilkins, who had been thrown out in the middle of the night with her 2 young sons. The case wasn't high profile. No media. No fanfare. Just another fight for dignity in a system stacked against them. As Elijah approached the counsel tables, a bailiff, a thick-set man with buzzed blonde hair and a permanent scowl, intercepted him. "You lost, son?" he asked, voice dripping condescension. Elijah's smile was tight but polite. "No, sir." Attorney Elijah Cross, representing Ms. Wilkins. He held out his bar card and Georgia driver's license. The bailiff barely glanced at them. "Wait here," he muttered. Elijah watched as the man crossed to the judge's bench and whispered urgently. The judge, an older white man with thinning silver hair, frowned, peering at Elijah as if he were a stray dog wandering into a 5-star hotel. Whispers spread through the gallery. The opposing counsel, a well-known landlord attorney named Richard Stanton, smirked openly, shaking his head as he shuffled his papers. Within minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies entered the room, moving with deliberate purpose. Elijah stiffened. He knew that look. The same one he'd seen in grocery stores, in banks, on quiet suburban streets. Suspicion. Ownership. Dismissal. The deputies approached. "Mr. Cross, we're going to need you to come with us," one said gruffly. Elijah's heart slammed against his ribs. "On what grounds?" he asked carefully, voice low but firm. The other deputy held up a printout, a random, outdated registry list that didn't have Elijah's newly minted bar number yet. Impersonating a legal officer. Unauthorized practice of law. Gasps rippled through the small courtroom. Before Elijah could even finish protesting, cold steel clamped around his wrists. Someone in the back laughed. Someone else muttered, "Knew it." Elijah kept his head high as they shoved him through the courtroom doors. He wasn't ashamed. He was furious. And deep inside, beneath the calm mask, he made a silent vow. They would regret every second of this. The metal doors slammed shut behind Elijah with a hollow thud. The holding cell reeked of bleach and stale sweat. A single flickering bulb buzzed overhead. No windows. No clock. Just concrete walls and the sour taste of injustice hanging thick in the air. Elijah sat on the cold metal bench, wrists still cuffed, suit jacket rumpled, tie askew. In the corner of the room, 2 deputies stood whispering to each other, occasionally throwing sideways glances at him. One chuckled under his breath. Elijah stared straight ahead, jaw locked tight. Impersonating a lawyer. It was absurd. He had graduated top of his class from Emory Law. Passed the bar exam on the first try. Worked late nights and weekends just to scrape together enough to open his own tiny practice. But none of that mattered in here. In here, he was just another problem. The cell door creaked open. A sergeant entered, mid-50s, wiry, sunglasses perched unnecessarily on his head even inside the building. He glanced at Elijah's file, then at Elijah himself, sneering slightly. "What's a guy like you doing playing dress-up?" he asked casually. Elijah said nothing. He'd learned that lesson years ago. Silence was safer. The sergeant stepped closer, his boots scuffing against the concrete. "You think a nice suit makes you somebody? Huh? You think flashing some fake credentials makes you better than the rest of M?" Still, Elijah remained silent, his fist clenching behind his back until his knuckles ached. The sergeant leaned down, his breath hot and sour. "Bet you didn't think you'd end up right where you belong." A slow, heavy pause. Elijah finally lifted his eyes to meet the man's gaze. No anger. No pleading. Just cold, focused rage simmering behind calm brown eyes. The sergeant straightened, discomfort flickering across his face for the briefest moment. "Keep him here," he barked to the deputies. "We'll process the charges this afternoon." As the door slammed shut again, Elijah exhaled slowly. Charges. For doing his job. For existing in the wrong courtroom with the wrong skin color. Hours bled by. No food. No water. No phone call. Every second was another reminder. They didn't see a lawyer. They didn't see a citizen. They saw a threat. Finally, the cell door opened again. This time, a deputy entered with a clipboard. "You're up," he said gruffly. Elijah rose, adjusting his ruined tie with quiet dignity. They led him through a maze of sterile hallways until they reached a small, windowless processing room. Behind the desk sat a clerk typing slowly on an ancient computer. The deputy shoved Elijah's paperwork toward her. "Book him. Charges: impersonation, fraud, misrepresentation of professional credentials." Elijah's jaw tightened so hard it hurt. Each word landed like a hammer blow. Felony charges. Not a ticket. Not a warning. Felony. They weren't just trying to humiliate him. They were trying to erase him. A criminal record meant disbarment. It meant no law license. It meant everything he had built, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, would vanish with a single keystroke. And they thought he would just accept it. But Elijah Cross wasn't done. Not even close. The clerk finished typing with a dull clack and handed the file to the deputy without looking up. The deputy skimmed it and sneered. "Guess it's true what they say. No matter how you dress it up, a snake's still a snake." Elijah stayed still, every muscle coiled tight under his ruined suit. "I want to speak to my attorney," he said firmly. The deputy chuckled, shaking his head as if Elijah had just asked for a ride to Disneyland. "You'll get your phone call after processing." "Maybe." The cuffs bit deeper into Elijah's wrists as they moved him down another hallway, each fluorescent light buzzing louder than the last. They took his fingerprints, snapped a mugshot, bagged his watch and wallet. No rights read. No access to a phone. No explanation. Just efficient, methodical dehumanization. Afterward, they dumped him back into a different holding cell, this one packed with half a dozen other men, some asleep on the benches, others pacing like caged animals. The stares he got were curious, then dismissive. A man in a stained hoodie leaned close. "What you in for?" he asked, half mocking. Elijah's voice was quiet but steady. "Practicing law while black." The man blinked, then barked a harsh laugh. "Ain't that America?" Hours passed. Elijah's mouth was dry. His stomach churned with hunger and rage. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down the hall, a fight broke out, guards shouting, inmates screaming. But Elijah sat motionless on the bench, his mind racing. He went over every step of his morning, every document he carried, every credential he presented, every rule he followed. There was nothing illegal, nothing improper, nothing wrong, except the fact that he didn't fit the picture they expected when they heard the word lawyer, and that made him guilty enough. Across the city, outside the courthouse walls, no one knew where he was. No one knew what was happening behind the marble facade. No reporters. No friends. No colleagues. Just silence. Finally, the cell door clanked open again. Two deputies stood waiting. One of them tossed Elijah a wrinkled orange jumpsuit. "Change. You're moving upstairs." Elijah caught the jumpsuit, his fingers tightening around the cheap fabric. He wasn't going to a hearing. He wasn't getting a call. They were moving to full incarceration. Without trial. Without due process. Without a voice. And for the first time all day, a flicker of real fear crawled up Elijah's spine. Because they weren't just trying to humiliate him anymore. They were trying to disappear him. But Elijah Cross knew something they didn't. They thought he was cornered. They thought they had one. They had no idea who they had just caged. And they would learn too late that the only thing more dangerous than a silenced man was a man who refused to stay silent. The elevator jerked to a stop on the 5th floor, maximum security holding. The doors slid open with a harsh metallic screech, revealing a row of reinforced cells behind thick bars and layers of bulletproof glass. This wasn't pretrial detention. This was a cage for people the system wanted buried. The deputy nudged Elijah roughly forward, muttering, "Welcome to your new office, counselor." The other inmates pressed against their glass walls, watching him pass, some curious, others laughing. Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face stayed calm, every step measured. They shoved him into cell 5C, slammed the door, and left without another word. The lock clicked, and then he was alone. Elijah sank slowly onto the narrow metal cot, the orange jumpsuit sagging around his frame, the fluorescent lights buzzing like angry insects overhead. He clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. This wasn't about a mistake. This wasn't about paperwork. This was deliberate. A system designed to chew him up and spit him out, nameless, voiceless, destroyed. But he refused to panic. He refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he began calculating. Because Elijah had one weapon they hadn't counted on. His mind. He went over the laws in his head like a prayer. Right to legal counsel. Right to a phone call. Right to due process. Right to be free from unlawful detention. Every hour they kept him without charging him officially. Every hour they denied him access to a lawyer, they were building his case. They thought they were erasing him. They were documenting their own destruction. Hours dragged by. The guards brought a tray of cold food, a slab of gray meat, a lump of instant potatoes. Elijah ignored it. He needed a clear head. He needed strength. The night shift changed. Different guards now younger, less hardened. One of them, a thin man with dark circles under his eyes, lingered outside Elijah's cell longer than necessary. Elijah noticed. The guard looked around nervously, then leaned closer to the glass. "You're the lawyer, right?" he whispered. Elijah nodded once. The guard's eyes darted down the hall. This ain't right, man. You're not supposed to be up here." Elijah's pulse quickened. "Help me get a message out," he said, voice low but urgent. "I need one phone call. Just one." The guard hesitated, fear flickering across his face. Helping Elijah could cost him his job, or worse. But somewhere deep down, buried under fear and training, some ember of decency still flickered. Finally, the guard gave a small nod. "I'll see what I can do." He disappeared down the hallway. Elijah sat back on the cot, heart pounding. He didn't know if the guard would come through. He didn't know if help was even possible anymore. But it didn't matter, because he wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. And if the system thought it could erase Elijah Cross without a fight, it was about to learn just how dangerous one man's determination could be. 2 agonizing hours later, the cell door clanked open. The young guard, the one with the dark circles, gestured urgently. "Let's go. Quick. You've got 5 minutes." Elijah rose without a word, every nerve wound tight, every step deliberate. The guard led him through a back corridor to a small utility room. A dusty, unused desk phone sat atop a cracked filing cabinet. "Dial out," the guard whispered. "Make it count." Elijah didn't hesitate. His fingers flew over the keypad, punching in a number from memory, one he never thought he'd need. Jordan Pierce, civil rights attorney. Minter. Friend. The line rang once. Twice. Then a gruff, familiar voice answered. "Pierce." Elijah kept his voice low, urgent. "It's Elijah. I'm in holding at Fulton County. Illegal detention. No phone call until now. They're charging me with impersonation." A beat of silence on the other end. Then Jordan's voice sharpened like a blade. "Who's your arresting officer?" "Sergeant Vance." Deputies Green and Walters. Judge in 2C was involved. Another pause. Then, "Sit tight. Say nothing else. You're about to have company." The line went dead. The young guard motioned him back toward the hallway. No words. Just fear in his eyes. Elijah allowed himself a tiny breath of relief. The cavalry was coming. But he knew better than to believe rescue would be simple. The system didn't like being challenged, especially by men who looked like him. The minutes stretched long and brutal. Back in his cell, Elijah sat rigid on the cot, staring at the flickering ceiling light, counting every heartbeat. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. Then the entire cell block shuddered as the heavy door at the far end slammed open. Boots pounded down the hallway. Not jail boots. Not deputies. Federal boots. The first figure into view was Jordan Pierce himself, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals in navy jackets, badges flashing. Behind them, a grim-faced woman in a dark suit carrying a clipboard. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. The guards scrambled to attention, babbling excuses, pointing fingers. Jordan pushed past them, zeroed in on Elijah's cell. "Open it," he barked. The guards hesitated. One reached for his radio. Jordan's voice cut sharper. "Open it now, or I start reading names into my lawsuit." The cell door buzzed open with a reluctant clank. Elijah stepped out, still silent, still burning. Jordan clapped a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're with me now, son. Let's go." As they marched down the hallway, Elijah caught sight of Sergeant Vance, the smug officer who had sneered at him that morning. Vance's face was pale, his mouth working uselessly as Jordan leveled a glare at him. "You're gonna need a lawyer," Jordan said coldly. A good one. They pushed through the exit doors into the cool night air. Free. But Elijah knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The system would try to spin it. Try to bury it. Try to make it all disappear. But this time, Elijah Cross wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every black professional who had ever been treated like a criminal for daring to exist in spaces they weren't supposed to occupy. And he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. They didn't even make it back to Jordan's law office before the plan was already in motion. In the back seat of the marshal's SUV, Elijah sat hunched over a legal pad, scrawling notes in fast, brutal strokes. "We're not just filing a lawsuit," he said, voice low but steady. "We're triggering a federal civil rights investigation." Jordan watched him with something close to pride. "You're thinking bigger." "Good." Elijah nodded sharply. He outlined it all, his mind slicing through the steps like a trained blade. False arrest, no probable cause. Unlawful detention, denial of access to counsel. Malicious prosecution, fabricated charges without evidence. Systemic discrimination, pattern of targeting black professionals across county institutions. Jordan whistled low. "You're not just taking down the courthouse," he said. "You're taking down their entire machine." Elijah didn't smile. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for justice. And he was going to rip the rot out by its roots. By the time they reached the law office, it was close to midnight. But the building buzzed with life: paralegals, junior attorneys, even a few law students scrambling to set up laptops, print case law, draft preliminary motions. Jordan's team moved like soldiers under fire. Elijah stepped into the war room, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. They filed the first motion before dawn. Cross versus Fulton County Sheriff's Office, Sergeant Vance, Deputies Green and Walters, and Judge Patrick Harrow. The complaint was brutal. Violation of constitutional rights, 4th and 14th Amendments. Racial discrimination under Section 1983. Malicious prosecution. Emotional distress and physical harm. Elijah insisted on attaching scanned copies of his Georgia bar credentials, his law school diploma, and even his first court victory as a licensed attorney. Every receipt. Every proof. Every truth. By 8 a.m., the case hit the federal court system. By 8:15, local news outlets caught wind of it. Young black attorney illegally detained in Fulton County Courthouse. By 9 o'clock, the courthouse where Elijah had been dragged out in cuffs sat under siege, cameras flashing, reporters swarming the steps, demanding answers. Inside, Judge Patrick Harrow barricaded himself in chambers, refusing interviews. Sheriff's officials issued a bland, vague statement. "We take all allegations seriously and are committed to a full investigation." But the footage was already leaking. Someone, probably a sympathetic court clerk, had released the security tapes anonymously. It showed everything. Elijah calmly presenting his ID. The bailiff whispering urgently to the judge. Deputies grabbing him without cause. There was no resisting arrest. No aggressive behavior. Just a young black lawyer standing tall and being torn down anyway. The public fury was immediate and volcanic. Civil rights groups demanded resignations. Local leaders condemned the courthouse actions. Even the Georgia Bar Association released a rare public statement, defending Elijah's license and warning against racially motivated attacks on members of the legal community. Elijah watched it unfold from Jordan's office window, his hands folded tightly behind his back. This wasn't just about his name anymore. It was about all of them. And for the first time since those cold cuffs closed around his wrists, he allowed himself a single, hard smile. They thought they could bury him. But all they had done was plant a seed they couldn't stop from growing. By noon, the offers started coming in. The first was a phone call from a panicked county attorney. "Mr. Cross, we deeply regret what happened. We are prepared to offer a settlement, confidential, of course, with full dismissal of all charges and a financial compensation package." Translation. "Take the money. Disappear. Let us bury this." Elijah didn't even let him finish. "No deal," he said, voice flat. Click. The second came in the form of a hastily arranged apology letter emailed directly from Judge Patrick Harrow's office. It was a masterpiece of evasion. "We regret any misunderstanding that may have occurred regarding your presence at the courthouse. No harm was intended. No harm." Elijah read it once, then deleted it without a second thought. They didn't regret what they had done. They regretted getting caught. By 2 p.m., even the Fulton County Sheriff's Department tried to join the parade of desperation. A spokesperson nervously offered to review procedures and suggested a private meeting to resolve tensions. Jordan Pierce laughed out loud when he heard it. "They're bleeding," he said, flipping through the growing stack of media clippings. "And you're twisting the knife every time you say no." But Elijah wasn't after money. He wasn't after headlines. He was after accountability. Real, public, undeniable. No private settlements. No gag orders. No half-hearted apologies printed in the back pages of the newspaper. They had dragged him out of a courtroom in handcuffs for daring to exist where they thought he didn't belong. They weren't going to erase that with a check. By sunset, national media outlets had picked up the story. CNN, MSNBC, even distant affiliates in New York and Los Angeles. Young black lawyer illegally detained while representing client. Fulton County faces federal lawsuit after racial profiling incident. Legal system under fire after shocking video surfaces. Civil rights leaders called for an emergency town hall. Law professors wrote op-eds demanding judicial resignations. Social media roared with hashtags. Hashtag justice for Elijah. Hashtag law while black. Hashtag we belong too. Under the mounting pressure, the Georgia Judicial Oversight Commission quietly opened an ethics investigation into Judge Harrow. Sheriff's deputies involved were placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and Fulton County's Board of Commissioners scheduled a special session to discuss systemic reforms. But Elijah wasn't done yet. That night, sitting at Jordan's conference table with his battered briefcase at his side, Elijah outlined his next move. Full public trial. Mandatory public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Structural reforms inside Fulton County court system, with third-party monitors for 5 years. Personal public apologies, under oath, from every official involved. Jordan whistled low. "You're not just fighting for yourself anymore," he said. Elijah met his gaze, steady as stone. "I know," he said. "That's why I can't afford to lose." He leaned forward, his voice dropping into something harder than steel. "They opened this fight, but I'm the one who's going to finish it." The courtroom was packed. Every pew filled with reporters, activists, attorneys, and ordinary citizens who saw in Elijah a reflection of themselves. At the front sat the defendants. Sergeant Vance, arms folded, jaw tight. Deputies Green and Walters, staring blankly ahead. And Judge Patrick Harrow himself, red-faced, hiding behind a wall of lawyers. Elijah sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Jordan Pierce and 2 junior attorneys. But when the judge called the case to order, it was Elijah Cross who stood up. Not his lawyers. Not a hired mouthpiece. Him. The room held its breath. Elijah's voice, steady and sharp, sliced through the tension. "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." Murmurs rippled across the room. The presiding judge, a visiting federal judge from outside Fulton County, nodded slightly, masking what looked like approval. Jordan leaned back in his chair, smiling tightly. This wasn't just about winning. It was about showing them, proving, in the most public way possible, that Elijah didn't just belong, he excelled. The defense opened with every dirty tactic they had left. They questioned his credentials. They hinted he had been disruptive. They implied his demeanor had intimidated courthouse staff. Thinly veiled attacks. Dog whistles. But Elijah stood firm. Piece by piece, he dismantled them. He presented his bar registration, time-stamped and verified. He showed his certification letters, court records, successful cases. He played the courthouse security footage for the jury, frame by brutal frame. Elijah showing ID. Elijah calmly explaining his role. Deputies grabbing him without cause. No shouting. No threats. Only professionalism, met with profiling. When it was Elijah's turn to cross-examine Sergeant Vance, the courtroom fell so quiet you could hear the ticking of the courtroom clock. Elijah approached slowly, deliberate. "Sergeant Vance," he began, his voice a perfect balance of calm and steel. "When you ordered my arrest, had you verified my credentials?" Vance shifted uncomfortably. "I was told there was reason to believe." "Yes or no, Sergeant?" Elijah cut in, voice crisp. "Had you verified them?" "No." "Had you called the Georgia Bar Association?" "No." "Had you checked the court's own attorney registry?" Vance's face flushed deep red. "No." Elijah stepped closer. "So your entire justification for putting me in handcuffs, detaining me without cause, denying me a phone call for nearly 24 hours, was based on what?" Vance's mouth opened and closed. No words came. Elijah's voice dropped lower, sharper. "It was based on one thing, wasn't it, Sergeant? It was based on how I looked." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. No objections came. The defense attorney sat frozen, knowing the jury saw it too. Elijah turned slowly, facing the 12 men and women who would decide his fate. His voice was soft now, but every syllable struck like a hammer. They didn't see a lawyer. They didn't see a citizen. They saw a threat. He let the silence stretch. Let them feel it. Let them live in it. And then, quietly, I ask for nothing more than what the Constitution already promises me. Dignity. Due process. Justice. He returned to his seat. The courtroom exhaled in one long, collective breath. Across the aisle, Sergeant Vance sagged in his chair. The defense's case had crumbled, and Elijah Cross hadn't raised his voice once. He had simply shown them the truth they had tried so hard to bury. And now, there was no turning away from it. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. 3 hours that felt like 3 lifetimes. Elijah sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, fingertips lightly pressed together, his breathing slow and steady. Every fiber of him remained calm, at least on the outside. Inside, the storm raged. He thought about the chains, the cuffs, the cold cell walls, the smirks, the laughter. He thought about how close they had come to erasing him, to branding him a criminal for daring to stand tall. And now, everything hung in the balance. When the jury filed back into the room, the air grew electric. 12 faces, tense, serious, unblinking. The presiding judge, an older woman with kind eyes but a voice like iron, turned to the foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a black woman in her 50s with a steady gaze, stood. We have, Your Honor. A folded sheet of paper was passed to the bailiff, then to the judge. The judge read it, her expression unchanged. She returned it to the foreman. Please read the verdict aloud. The foreman cleared her throat. In the matter of Cross versus Fulton County Sheriff's Department and related defendants, on the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The foreman continued. On the claim of unlawful detention and denial of legal counsel, we find for the plaintiff. Another wave of murmurs. On the claim of malicious prosecution, we find for the plaintiff. And finally, on the claim of racial discrimination under Section 1983, we find for the plaintiff. The final blow. For counts. For victories. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispered prayers, clenched fists raised quietly in triumph. Elijah exhaled, a deep, shaking breath that seemed to lift years of weight from his shoulders. The judge banged her gavel once for order. The jury awards compensatory damages in the amount of $2.5 million, the foreman read, and punitive damages in the amount of $5 million. The defense table sagged visibly. Vance buried his face in his hands. Judge Harrow slumped backward, staring blankly at the wall. But Elijah didn't celebrate. He didn't pump his fist. He didn't shout. He simply bowed his head for a long moment, honoring not just his own fight, but the countless others who had never lived to see this kind of justice. The judge's voice broke through his thoughts. Mr. Cross, this court recognizes the injustice you suffered. We also recognize your extraordinary courage in standing against it. You remind this court, and all courts, of the dignity the law is supposed to protect. Elijah stood slowly, his face unreadable, his posture proud. He had endured everything they threw at him. He had stood alone when it mattered most. And now, he stood victorious, not because they gave him justice, but because he had forced it from them. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with reporters, flashing cameras, chanting supporters. But Elijah paused in the hallway, his hand resting lightly on the cool marble wall. He didn't need the headlines. He didn't need the noise. The victory was already written. In every step he refused to retreat. In every truth he refused to swallow. This fight had never been about headlines. It had been about something sacred. And now, it was won. Elijah Cross didn't stand for interviews. He didn't lift a fist to the cameras. He didn't give speeches. He didn't bask in the spotlight others tried to shove on him. Instead, he slipped quietly out the courthouse's side entrance, the noise of the crowd fading behind him like a distant storm. The cool Atlanta evening wrapped around him, clean and still. He pulled off his tie, stuffed it into his jacket pocket, and stood for a long moment under a rusting street lamp, breathing in the night air. Freedom. Not given. Taken. A freedom forged not just from courtroom victories, but from refusing to bow when everything, the cuffs, the isolation, the whispered threats, told him to stay down. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Dozens of messages, congratulations, offers from major law firms, invitations to speak. He ignored them all. Tonight wasn't about the future. It was about the journey here, the one paved with humiliation, with rage, with loneliness. And still, he endured. Elijah walked to a small park nearby, an unremarkable patch of grass and cracked concrete, and sat on an empty bench beneath an old oak tree. No cameras, no microphones, just the soft rustle of leaves overhead and the muted hum of the city breathing around him. He leaned back, staring up at the stars poking through the gaps in the clouds. He thought of every kid who would see his story and know that they belonged in that courtroom just as much as anyone else. He thought of every parent who would now have one more reason to tell their children, "Your skin is not a crime." And he thought about the system that had tried to break him and failed. Not because he was loud, not because he had power, but because he never let them take the one thing they couldn't forge or fake or fabricate: his dignity. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But tonight, Elijah Cross reclaimed something bigger than a verdict. He reclaimed his right to exist without apology. He sat there a little longer, the city moving on around him, a quiet, immovable monument to what one man's refusal to disappear could mean. And when he finally stood, he didn't look back. He didn't have to. The world had already changed, even if only by an inch. It was enough. For now. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire action and hope.